Well, for those of you who may or may not know me, my name is Logan Mondshein, and I'm the benefits practice leader at Associated Financial Consultants. We are an independent insurance agency that specializes in a few different things, employee benefits being one, retirement planning, and wealth planning. And I have the pleasure of today interviewing Andrew Gordon of Hinshaw Law, who is an employment and labor attorney. And I'll let Andrew kind of tell a little more about himself as well.
Great. Thanks, Logan, and thanks again for hosting me today. I appreciate it. For all of you here with us today, again, my name is Andrew Gordon. I'm an attorney at the law firm of Hinshaw and Culbertson. I'm based here in Fort Lauderdale. My law firm's home office is Chicago, and we've got offices from coast to coast here in the U.S., including 3 offices here in Florida, Fort Lauderdale, Coral Gables, and Tampa. I specialize my practice, as Logan said, in employment law. I represent businesses of all sizes here in Florida and throughout the U.S., and I help them avoid problems with their employees. And I do that through a number of different ways, including talking about very difficult topics like the one we're here to talk about today. I draft employee agreements, employee handbooks. I do training with my clients, and I'm here for them to help avoid issues on the front end, which is always my goal with my clients, keep them out of trouble. But despite our best efforts, especially these days, clients of mine and businesses across the US will get in trouble. And when they do, I'm here to help my clients address those issues, whether they be with the Department of Labor, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or their state counterparts. And I also assist my clients in employment-related litigation in federal court, state court, and arbitration. So that's a little bit about me professionally and what I do. I don't want to bore you too much, but I think that helps provide some context in terms of what we're here to talk about today and how I can specifically answer some of these questions we're going to be going over today.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much, Andrew. So I'm just going to shoot it out and start with the question. And, to start, we work with small and mid-sized businesses. And a lot of these questions that, Andrew, as we discussed, I've gotten from my clients that they've asked me that they don't know. So I'm just going to start out with the first one. Andrew, can an employer ask employees if they're vaccinated?
Yes. And Logan, before I start answering questions, I just want everyone here with us today to know that my answers are going to be specific to how things work here in Florida. I'm not necessarily going to talk about how things work out in crazy California or crazy New York or any other state than Florida, but a lot of my answers do apply outside of Florida. So just keep that in mind. So to answer your question, Logan, which I believe is, can employers ask their employees if they're vaccinated? The answer to that is yes. And we have guidance from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and you'll hear me talk about them a lot today. I'll refer to them as the EEOC. The EEOC is in charge of enforcing federal employment laws here in the U.S. from coast to coast. So they're the authority in terms of what employers can and cannot do. And the EEOC early on in this pandemic said, yes, you can ask about vaccination status, and you can ask about whether someone has COVID-19 symptoms. Employers are free to ask a whole lot of questions when it comes to trying to keep their workplace safe, including whether or not an employee is vaccinated. And that's true here in Florida and throughout the US. But again, I'm going to try to keep most of my answers as specific to Florida as possible, because there are a lot of crazy things happening throughout the US. In fact, there's a lot of state capitals that are considering laws that would prohibit employers from asking questions about vaccination status in certain states. That's not happening here in Florida, but in some states, bills are being considered that would limit employers' ability to ask certain questions, just like the one you posed just now.
If you don't mind me asking, what states are looking at that right now?
Yeah, so I don't have a complete list of the states that are looking at it, but I believe that at last check, there were over 10 states that were considering, and I think it was as high as 18, considering some type of legislation that would actually curtail employers' ability to ask certain questions about vaccination status.
So now that we've discovered it's okay for an employer to ask an employee if they're vaccinated, can an employer require an employee to be vaccinated?
Yeah, and so those of you with us today, I don't know how often you talk to attorneys, but most attorneys like to hedge their bets. I'm going to try to not do that today and give you some straightforward answers. And the answer to that question, Logan, is yes, employers can mandate vaccines in the workplace. There are a couple exceptions to that. One being you can't require someone who has a sincerely held religious belief that prevents them from getting vaccines of any kind from getting the COVID-19 vaccine. And if someone has a health-related issue that rises to the level of an Americans with Disabilities Act issue, you can't require that person to get a vaccine either. But outside those two exceptions, employers have a lot of leeway when it comes to mandating vaccines. And again, I'm going to talk about the EEOC. The EEOC has told us through guidance that they have issued, which is publicly available by doing a basic Google search, that employers have the right to do this. And when the EEOC tells an employer they have the right to do something, again, that's a pretty authoritative stance that gives the employer a whole lot of leeway when it comes to how they manage their workplaces.
So now that we've discovered obviously that employers can ask employees if they're vaccinated, can require vaccinations, what happens should an employee refuse to get a vaccination, besides for one of the reasons that you just told us about?
Right. So again, this may be surprising to some of the folks with us here today, but from a pure technical legal standpoint, if an employee refuses to get a vaccine after an employer mandates that it's necessary, that employee, unless they fall into one of those two categories we just covered, sincerely held religious belief or an ADA issue, can be terminated. And again, I know that may sound surprising, if not shocking, to some of our participants today, but again, the EEOC has provided guidance that supports the statement I've said today. And it's important to keep in mind, a lot of these issues in terms of what you can and can't ask your employees about vaccination status, whether you can mandate vaccines, think about the flu vaccine, for instance, and whether you can terminate an employee who decides they don't want to get a certain mandated vaccine. These rights of employers existed prior to COVID-19. It's just that they haven't been talked about very frequently because, quite frankly, when was the last time we were in a pandemic like we are now? We haven't been for generations. So both employers and employees haven't had to address these issues for a long time. And despite the fact that employers could take the same stance they are now when it comes to COVID-19 related issues in the workplace, prior to COVID-19, if you're talking about the flu, for instance, they never really needed to, because the flu is what it is and it doesn't impact and shut down economies like COVID-19 has. So employers never really flexed the muscle very much when it came to mandating flu vaccines. But these rights for employers have existed for decades. And again, they're now being talked about a whole lot more because of the situation we're facing because of COVID-19. And so for a lot of people, this is the first time they're hearing that employers have these types of rights. And it's one of the reasons why you are seeing certain states take action to try to curtail some of these pretty enormous rights that businesses have relative to their employees that a lot of people just have never had to think about until this pandemic.
So, it's very valid points. We've never had to think about this. For most people on this call today and watching, we've never had a pandemic in any of our generations. We've never gone through this, so it's definitely a first and hopefully last in most of our lifetimes.
Right.
What I'm seeing as a best practice, at least most of my clients are not requiring vaccines, but they are starting to incentivize some of their employees to get vaccines. Legally, can they do that?
Right. So I would agree with you. I think, again, if you watch the late night news or wherever you get your news, you read the paper, whatever your situation may be, you probably are reading a lot about how a lot of the big chains, for instance, or the big box stores are not mandating vaccines of their employees, but they're very, very strongly encouraging that their employees get vaccinated. And in some cases, they're incentivizing their employees to get vaccinated through drawings of get vaccinated and you'll be entered to win a golf cart, or get vaccinated and we'll give you 2 hours worth of your time for the hassle of getting vaccinated. And again, the EEOC has told us that yes, employers generally speaking can incentivize their workers to get the vaccine. The only caveat there is the incentive can't be so much as to, for instance, result in an employee who gets the vaccine getting a promotion, for instance, at the expense of someone who doesn't get the vaccine, who isn't allowed that type of opportunity to move up in the company. So the incentives are permitted, but they can't be so much as to be what the EEOC calls coercive, right? So if you had a pool of employees and you tell that pool of employees, I will only be considering bonuses for the 2021 year for my employees who get the vaccine. Well, that's not fair, because you're going to have employees who can't get the vaccine because of a sincerely held religious belief or an ADA issue, sitting on the sidelines saying, well, despite the fact I have a legal reason for not getting the vaccine, I feel like I'm being coerced to get it because of this bonus pool to which I'm not eligible unless I get the vaccine is substantial enough to cause me to throw aside a sincerely held religious belief or forget about my health issue and get that vaccine. That's considered coercive, and that's something that EEOC is trying to avoid.
It's very valid. So can an employer ask them without the honor system, let's say they have them sign some sort of affidavit, can that employer ask to see their vaccination card, or is there any discrimination against that?
Yes, so that's another instance where, surprisingly, maybe to some, employers have the ability to say, I know you're telling me you're vaccinated, but I want you to prove it. And how do you prove it? You produce the vaccination card. And there's nothing wrong with employers asking their employees to prove that they're vaccinated. So for instance, and we'll probably talk about this more today, but if an employer wants to decide that they want to follow the CDC's recent guidelines for mask wearing indoors, well, the CDC has said people who are vaccinated don't really have to wear masks anymore whatsoever. So if you wanted to apply that to your workforce and you wanted to make sure that in fact only your vaccinated employees are going maskless, the only way to really enforce that other than the honor system is to ask your employees for their vaccination cards. And employers are legally permitted to do that, and we've been told so by the EEOC.
So you're going to have some company cultures who aren't going to let go of their employees who aren't vaccinated, more paternal. So it comes to the instance of, can you legally say, okay, employees who are vaccinated, you can come back into the office. Unvaccinated employees, we're asking you not to come back to the office.
Yeah, so that is another example of a measure certain employers may want to take. And it's important to keep in mind that there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all approach to how employers decide to bring their employees back to the workplace and what measures they have in place to continue to ensure their workplaces are as safe as possible from the spread of COVID-19. But one measure we know is legally permissible is keeping unvaccinated employees at home and only allowing those who are vaccinated to return to the workplace. That is something that has been signed off on by numerous governmental agencies as non-discriminatory and something that employers could certainly consider if they wanted to implement.
With that being said, let's say you have an employee who says, okay, well, I'm vaccinated, but I still want to work from home. But the company policies then is, hey, unvaccinated people have to return to the office. We're almost through this pandemic. Can you legally fire that employee or let that employee go for not wanting to come back into the office?
Right. So again, employers have a wide latitude here when it comes to their decisions about how to handle their workplaces, and each one's going to implement their policies and procedures as they see fit relative to their company culture. But the employer does have the upper hand in the situation you just described. And if an employer implements a clear policy in terms of its return to work strategy and implements it consistently across the board, and has an employee who just decides they don't want to adhere to the return to work policy, that's a violation of company policy. And unless that employee has a very good reason for not complying with the policy, that employee could be subject to discipline just as if he or she had violated any other company policy. It doesn't matter that this happens to be COVID-19 related, it's still a company policy, and you violate company policy at your own peril.
Good point. So with companies beginning to bring employees back, is there any liability to the companies should they have a COVID outbreak and it's contracted by an employee at that point, either vaccinated or unvaccinated?
Right. So that's a real good question. And this is an interesting one for Florida, because what we've done here in Florida through our state legislature this past year is there was a massive piece of legislation. In fact, it was the first bill that Governor DeSantis signed into law, and it's meant to limit the liability of businesses who have COVID-19 outbreaks in the workplace. And what this bill does is it creates a very, very, very high bar that an employee has to get over before their complaint in state court or federal court can even take on a life of its own. The employee basically has to go to a judge before the case is filed and tell the judge, my employer did nothing to try to comply in good faith with national, state, or local directives relating to COVID-19 safety measures in the workplace. And we know here in Florida that there aren't a whole lot of difficult COVID-19 safety measures left in the workplace, because a lot of the mandates have been removed over the last few months, culminating as recently as, I believe, 3 weeks ago with the CDC changing its mask mandate. So if an employee claims he or she got COVID-19 in the workplace, they've got two real big issues here in Florida. First of all, they have to prove that they got COVID-19 in the workplace, which is very difficult to do, because how on earth do you definitively point to where you contracted COVID-19? It's nearly impossible in most cases. But even if an employee was able to do that, you have the added protection here in Florida of the piece of legislation I just described that makes it unusually difficult for an employee to file a complaint against employers throughout the state of Florida. So I don't think we'll be seeing a lot of potential exposure or liability to employers as they bring their employees back to the workplace, because all they have to do is show that they made a good faith effort to comply with whatever national, state, or local directives there are relating to safety in the workplace regarding COVID-19. And it's going to be very difficult for employees to work around that and to prove they definitively got COVID-19 in the workplace.
I believe you answered this question in there, but I want to clarify. In regards to workplace safety, are employers, do they need to provide PPE to employees and or guests that do come into the office?
Right. So generally, the answer to that is no. There are some specific industries, and I'm going to not bore everyone with what they are, but I suspect 99% of our participants are not in these industries that might be technically required to provide PPE to their employees. But for instance, an accounting firm, as an example, has no obligation whatsoever to provide any PPE to its employees as they return to the workplace. Period, end of story. And again, that's true for 99% of businesses. So as businesses open back up in the coming days, weeks, and months, PPE is certainly something that should not be on the top of their radar. Now, that being said, there's practical measures employers could take to make their employees feel more safe as they come back to the workplace. And quite frankly, a lot of these are already being done by employers. Take, for instance, the availability of hand sanitizer. at a reception area, or the availability of disposable masks if someone comes to your office and forgets their mask. So there's ways to provide things to your employees and to your customers or clients, not necessarily in the form of PPE, but just practical day-to-day things you can do to make the workplace feel safer, both for your employees and customers.
That's good. A lot of employers are doing that. You walk in most places and they'll offer you a mask if you don't have one, even now with the relaxed CDC guidelines.
Right.
Must call out Andrew as a fellow Florida State grad. Love the cup, buddy. Love the cup.
I had a feeling you would pick up on that. And I know for sure.
Yeah, that one wasn't going to get past me.
I know for sure, looking at our participant list, that we've got a few UF participants here, but also a few more FSU participants. But good catch on the cup. I did legitimately need a drink of water, and I didn't strategically choose that cup. That was a good
You've
catch.
been saying a lot, but we want to educate not everybody's perfect. We still want to educate other people who attended universities in Florida. May not be Florida State University, but we still want to help them out a little bit.
That's funny.
So we've talked about how you deal with non-compliant employees. But the culture, at least in most industries, you've seen the last number of years with doing more with less. You've seen people coming into work when they're sick. We're in a new era. How should legally employees handle if someone comes in with a common cold, non-COVID, and things that maybe we all probably would have worked through in the past?
Yeah, so this question's interesting to me because you can ask anyone that I've worked with in the legal profession the last 13 years, and a pet peeve of mine is when someone pre-COVID, for instance, comes to work sick. Drives me absolutely crazy. Someone comes to work, they're coughing, they're sneezing, they're clearly under the weather. That was a problem prior to COVID, and it was a problem that employers at the time had the ability to address. Again, even prior to COVID, employers had the right to send home employees who were showing symptoms of being sick. Most employers don't exercise that right, at least prior to COVID, but now, as we come in to bring in employees back to the office, hopefully on the tail end of this pandemic, that's a right, again, that has existed for decades for employers. It is acutely important that employers finally start flexing that muscle and enforcing that right. And if someone shows up to the workplace sick, regardless of their vaccination status, but obviously even more important if someone's unvaccinated, that employee has got to get out of there immediately, period, end of story. And again, this is a right that has existed for decades, hasn't always been enforced as much as I personally would like it enforced. But I think, again, coming back to the office during the tail end of this pandemic, it's one that most employers are going to be acutely aware of and are likely finally going to start putting their foot down and enforcing appropriately across the board. And again, that's regardless of vaccination status, right? So if you've got an employee who claims he or she's vaccinated and in fact can even produce their vaccination card, who shows up to the office sick, you got to send that employee home. It doesn't matter that he or she may be vaccinated. They could still be someone who unfortunately came down with COVID, or it could be the common cold, or it could be the flu, but it doesn't matter what it is. The policy should be that employee is asked to leave the office immediately, period, end of story.
I completely agree with you on that one. I've become a stickler myself, more so since COVID started, but I'm like, you work from home most days, just work from home if you're sneezing.
Right. And, it's interesting because as the workforce, for the most part, has adopted this working from home situation, I think we're in a scenario now where employers should feel more comfortable telling their employees, hey, you're obviously not feeling well, go home, take care of yourself. And if you're up for it, guess what? The employee probably has learned how to work remotely, and that employee could probably go home and do their work without necessarily having to take a bunch of sick time off, but you're also protecting your workforce by not having someone who's sick, whether it's with COVID or something else, hanging out in the office for the next 2 weeks.
Infecting the whole office, I like to say.
Exactly. But you won't necessarily in every case lose that productivity for 2 weeks of that employee, because we've all had to adapt quite a bit over the last 13, 14, 15 months. So there's scenarios now where employers should be a little more nimble and understand it's okay to ask employees to go home when they're sick, keeping in mind there might be opportunities for that employee to continue their work at home despite possibly being sick, because they've learned how to work remotely. And that's a tool employers should keep in their tool chest in order to keep productivity up and not be afraid to send employees home who are sick.
That's a very valid point. Speaking kind of in the family and realm home, a lot of children and a lot of families have yet to send their children back to a school. Maybe they're doing remote or virtual school. Legally, I think I know the answer based on your other answers, but if an employee comes to an employer and says, I don't have childcare, I need to work from home, can that employer tell them, no, you have to come in?
Yeah, so that's a tough question. I can tell you that during the heart of this pandemic, after the Families First Coronavirus Relief Act was passed, which I think was in
March,
April,
I think.
whatever it was, March or April of last year, if an employee's school was closed, their kid's school was closed because of a COVID-19 related issue, they arguably would have been entitled to protection under Families First if the employer was a covered entity, meaning they had 500 or less employees. That law has since sunsetted as of December 31st of 2020 and is now only voluntary. So there are some businesses that have voluntarily chosen to continue protecting their employees under Family First. So if the school is closed because of a COVID-19 related issue, and when I say schools, that includes nurseries, daycares, things of that nature. If any of those are closed because of a COVID-19 related issue, that employee might arguably be protected under Families First, which again is now voluntary. But if a business has decided to voluntarily implement Families First on an ongoing basis, they'd have to honor that decision that they've made, and that employee might be protected under Families First. Absent of protection under Families First, if you simply don't have childcare and it's unrelated to COVID and you're not covered by Families First and you can't come to the office because of it, that's a problem. And your employer, just like they did prior to this pandemic, could take measures against you if you aren't coming to work to do your job. Certainly that employee could take paid time off, vacation time to deal with the lack of childcare, but that's not going to last all summer in most cases. So again, absent coverage under Families First, or a policy that the company may have decided to voluntarily put in place on top of or in lieu of Families First, if an employee doesn't have childcare and they're using that as a reason to not come to work, that employee can take PTO, take vacation, but after that, it could be a problem that could certainly lead to discipline, including possible termination.
And I assume that goes the same for if a company has or has not implemented the Families First, that goes the same for any spouses or family members for children as well, correct?
Right, same thing. So prior to Families First technically sunsetting in December of 2020, if you were a covered business, 500 or less employees, and you had a spouse that came down with COVID-19, you would have protections under Family First, and you would be allowed to stay home, not work, and in most cases recover a large, if not the entire portion of the pay you were missing out on for a certain period of time. That's all now voluntary. And again, if a business has voluntarily elected to implement Families First, they have to adhere to Families First, including the protections it affords in situations like you just described, Logan, in order to retain those attractive tax credits that they get, that I'll talk about in a second. But absent coverage by Families First or a generous company policy in lieu of or to supplement Families First, these days, if someone in the family comes down with COVID-19, that employee has the ability, again, to take PTO, to take vacation. And after that, they are going to be in a tough situation. They might arguably be entitled to leave under the Family Medical Leave Act, but that's debatable and very, very fact specific. So I'm not going to necessarily get into that. But yeah, that would be a tough spot for that employee to be in. But just real quickly, and I suspect a lot of the participants will want to hear this, if you are a business that is voluntarily implementing Families First, it's extremely important that you implement it as if it was a requirement, like it was before it sunsetted in December of last year. And that's because if you all of a sudden are implementing Families First in an arbitrary type manner, meaning this employee you're going to give some benefits to under Families First, but this other one you don't really like so much, you're not going to give them the benefits. That could jeopardize that tax incentive that you have that is actually paying for the benefits dollar for dollar in the form of a payroll tax credit. So it's very important that if you are a business voluntarily implementing Families First, that you do it consistently across the board so you can get that big tax credit that is basically bankrolling the entire program.
It's a very valid point. It should probably be in their employee handbook as well if they're going to implement that as well, to let employees know.
Yeah, so that's an interesting one, and I can go either way on that. So generally speaking, because Families First on a voluntary basis is on the books and I believe is running through September of this year, it could be something that employers choose to include in their handbook, or alternatively, which is just as good, if not a better solution, is to issue a separate freestanding policy so that your employee handbook isn't constantly having to be updated and changed if you formally adopt it in your employee handbook. Whereas